The reason why Motown has inspired so many people, I think, is because it was perfect. Well, it spoke to every person of every age, of every color. And who wouldn't want to emulate that?
Motown Records wasn't just a music label, it was a movement. Founded by Berry Gordy Jr. in 1959, it became the home of legendary artists like the Supremes, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye. It defined a generation, blending soul, pop, and R&B into a sound that crossed racial barriers and dominated the charts. But despite its success, Motown didn't last. By the late 1980s, the powerhouse that once ruled the music industry had faded. So what happened? Why did Motown fall? Let's break it down. For over a decade, Motown thrived in Detroit, where its artists, songwriters, and producers worked closely under one roof at Hitsville, USA. But in 1972, Berry Gordy made a controversial move. He relocated the label to Los Angeles. The goal? To expand into Hollywood and break into film and television. While this helped launch projects like Lady Sings the Blues starring Diana Ross, it also came at a heavy cost. Motown's success was built on a unique, collaborative environment in Detroit. Artists would walk into the studio at any time, bouncing ideas off each other. When the company moved, that sense of family disappeared. Many artists and songwriters didn't follow, and the magic that made Motown special started to fade. Holland Dozier Holland weren't just songwriters, they were hitmakers who crafted the very essence of Motown's golden era. Their departure in 1968 sent shockwaves through the label, leaving a void that was nearly impossible to fill. With them gone, Motown lost the driving force behind some of its biggest chart toppers, and the consistency that had once fueled its hit-making machine began to waver. Although Motown still had talented producers like Norman Whitfield and Smokey Robinson, the label's signature sound began to evolve in ways that didn't always connect with its core audience. As musical tastes shifted and Motown tried to adapt, the once polished, soulful sound that had made it famous started to fade. Berry Gordy attempted to keep the magic alive, but without Holland Dozier Holland's unmatched songwriting chemistry, Motown found itself struggling to maintain the same level of dominance. The loss of this powerhouse team wasn't just a business setback, it was a turning point that signaled the beginning of the end for Motown's reign over the music industry. Losing one or two stars might have been manageable, but Motown lost nearly all of its biggest names, and the impact was devastating. The Jackson 5, who had once been the label's biggest commercial act, felt trapped by strict creative restrictions and financial limitations. When they left for Epic Records in 1975, taking a young Michael Jackson with them, it was a major blow. Then came the Temptations, frustrated by changing leadership and what they saw as a lack of direction. Marvin Gaye, one of Motown's most innovative artists, clashed with the label over his evolving sound and financial disputes, eventually leaving for Columbia Records in 1982. Diana Ross, the face of Motown for years, departed in 1981 in search of greater artistic freedom and financial security with RCA. Even Smokey Robinson, one of Motown's original songwriters and executives, gradually distanced himself from the label. As these icons walked away, so did their massive fan bases. And with Motown struggling to develop new talent, the label's influence faded quickly. Once the home of superstars and chart toppers, Motown was now struggling to compete in an industry it had once dominated. Without its biggest stars, Motown was no longer the Motown the world once knew. Motown had built its empire on a polished, crossover-friendly sound, but by the 1970s, audiences were craving something different, grittier, more experimental, and more rhythm-driven music, while labels like Atlantic and Stax leaned into funk and socially conscious soul. And later, Def Jam pioneered hip-hop. Motown seemed stuck in the past, hesitant to fully embrace the changes sweeping the industry. Although artists like Rick James and Lionel Richie brought fresh energy to the label, they weren't enough to carry Motown into the new era. The rise of disco, funk, and eventually hip-hop meant that audiences were gravitating toward more daring, modern sounds, and Motown wasn't leading the charge anymore. As new artists emerged and new labels thrived, Motown's once revolutionary approach started to feel outdated. Instead of being the label that defined the culture, it was now struggling to keep up with it. The company that once set the tone for popular music was now chasing trends instead of creating them, a clear sign that its golden era was slipping away. Behind the scenes, money was becoming a serious issue. Many Motown artists felt they were underpaid despite selling millions of records. One of the first big departures was Mary Wells, who left in 1964 after My Guy became a huge hit. She felt she wasn't being compensated fairly, and other artists soon started asking the same questions. Marvin Gaye, Martha Reeves, and even the Jackson 5 had disputes over money. Lawsuits started piling up, and Motown's financial stability was crumbling. Without its biggest stars, and with rising legal battles, the company was losing the grip it once had on the industry. By the 80s, the music industry was evolving at a rapid pace. New labels were offering better deals, giving artists more creative freedom and financial rewards. Def Jam, Atlantic, and even newer independent labels were attracting rising talent. Meanwhile, Motown, once the dominant force in black music, was struggling to find its place in the new landscape. Its old formula wasn't working anymore, and the new competition was too strong. Motown had once been a hit factory, cranking out chart toppers year after year. But as key producers and songwriters left, the magic began to fade. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, Motown's hit count dropped significantly. While artists like Stevie Wonder and Lionel Richie kept the label alive, the golden era was long gone. Fewer hits meant less influence. And in an industry driven by success, Motown was slipping into the background. Berry Gordy had always dreamed of making Motown bigger than just music. The move to Los Angeles was meant to make that happen, but in doing so, Gordy started focusing more on film and television than the core music business. While movies like Lady Sings the Blues and The Wiz made an impact, they didn't bring in the same consistent success that music had. The label that had once been a powerhouse in the music industry was now stretched too thin. With its leader focused elsewhere, Motown lost its direction. By the 1980s, the music business had become big business. Major corporations were taking over, and independent labels like Motown found it harder to compete. Massive labels with huge marketing budgets were now controlling the industry. Motown, once the dominant force, no longer had the financial strength to keep up. Even with legendary artists, the industry had changed, and Motown was struggling to survive in this new corporate landscape. By the late 80s, Motown was no longer the powerhouse it once was. Seeing the decline, Berry Gordy made a tough decision. He sold the label to MCA Records for $61 million in 1988. It was the official end of an era. The label that had once shaped popular music was now just another brand under a major corporation. Although Motown continued releasing music under new ownership, it was never the same. The days of Hitsville USA, of back-to-back #1 records, of shaping a generation, those days were gone.